The night my parents showed up at my restaurant, they finished an $800 meal and then sent the server back with a message that there had to be some kind of mistake. Apparently, the bill wasn't supposed to apply to them because they were the owner's family. The strange part wasn't the money. It was the way they sat there smiling like nothing unusual had happened, like they hadn't disappeared from my life more than a decade earlier. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I was the only person in the room who remembered how things had actually ended. My name is Alara Vance. I'm 33. When people hear my story, they usually assume there was one big moment where everything suddenly became obvious.
One cruel comment, one dramatic fight, something clean and undeniable. But that's not how it felt growing up. For most of my childhood, it was just small things. Little differences that were easy to explain away if you wanted to believe everything was normal. My younger sister, Brielle, was the center of the house. That was just the unspoken rule. She was 3 years younger than me, energetic, loud in the way kids are when they know the room belongs to them. My parents adored her in this very visible, effortless way. When Brielle walked into a room, conversations shifted toward her without anyone needing to say it. At first, I didn't think of it as favoritism. I thought of it as Brielle being more interesting. She was the one people gathered around, the one my parents photographed constantly, the one whose school recitals or little performances got circled on the calendar in bright marker weeks ahead of time. If Brielle tried something new, the whole house adjusted around it. If I tried something new, it was more like a quiet personal hobby. I remember dinners where my parents asked Brielle long strings of questions about her day, what happened at dance class, what she and her friends were doing over the weekend, how she felt about some teacher or assignment. Their attention would stretch across the table toward her like a spotlight. And I would still be sitting there. Sometimes they'd turn to me after a while, almost like they'd suddenly remembered I was part of the conversation too. The questions were shorter then, more practical. How was school? Did you finish your homework? That kind of thing. Nothing hostile, nothing obviously cruel, just different. As a kid, you don't immediately translate that into resentment. Mostly you try to adjust yourself around it. You assume there's something about you that explains the difference. Maybe Brielle was more exciting. Maybe she needed more encouragement. Maybe I was just the quieter one. I started noticing it more clearly around middle school. Not because anything explosive happened, just because the pattern stopped feeling accidental. When Brielle succeeded at something, it was a family event. When I succeeded at something, it was acknowledged politely and then folded away like background noise. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel angry yet. I felt confused. I kept trying to figure out the rule I must be missing, the invisible line that determined which things mattered and which things didn't. Sometimes I'd watch the three of them talking across the living room and feel like I was observing another family's conversation instead of being part of my own. Not excluded exactly, just slightly outside the frame. At the time, I still believed it would even out eventually. That families naturally drifted like that when kids were young, but eventually the balance corrected itself. I had no idea that what I was seeing was the early version of a pattern that would follow us for years. I was 13 when the first moment happened that I couldn't quietly explain away anymore. By that age, I had already started getting interested in baking. It wasn't anything fancy yet, mostly things I found in old cookbooks from the library or little recipe cards printed from school computers. But once I started, it kind of took over my brain. I would sit in the kitchen after homework just staring at ingredients, trying to figure out how different textures worked together. Why one dough turned soft and another turned crisp. The problem was that our home computer sat in the living room, and it was shared territory. Brielle used it for games or videos most of the time, and my parents didn't like anyone occupying it for too long. If I wanted to look something up, techniques, recipes, anything, I usually had to do it quickly before someone else needed the space. Eventually, I realized something simple would solve the whole problem. A laptop. Not a new one. I'd already figured that part out. I'd spent weeks searching online at school and found a used one someone nearby was selling for about $75. It wasn't impressive. It was old and a little bulky, but it worked. For me, it felt like the kind of small tool that would open an entire world. I remember showing my parents the listing one evening. I explained what I wanted to use it for: schoolwork, mostly, and recipes. I had even written down the price because I thought that would help. $75 felt like something reasonable enough that maybe they wouldn't brush it aside. They didn't get angry. That's the part I remember clearly. They just looked at each other for a second and then told me money was tight. It was said in a calm, practical way. The kind of tone adults use when they're explaining something responsible and unavoidable. I nodded right away because I didn't want to seem ungrateful or pushy. I remember saying it was okay. And for a while, I genuinely believed them. A few weeks passed. Then one afternoon, I came home from school and the house looked different. The first thing I noticed was the sound of furniture being moved upstairs. My parents were in Brielle's room with a delivery crew. Boxes were stacked in the hallway. New bedding packages, decorative lamps, things wrapped in plastic. Brielle was practically vibrating with excitement. Her room was being completely redone. Over the next day or two, everything changed in there. New furniture, new decorations, custom pieces that had clearly been planned out ahead of time. My parents kept walking in and out carrying things, adjusting placements, stepping back to admire how it all looked. The total cost, I later overheard them discussing, was about $1,050. At 13, numbers like that feel enormous. I remember standing in the doorway at one point while they were still arranging things. Brielle was spinning around in the middle of the room, thrilled, showing off each new piece like it was a prize. No one noticed how quiet I'd got. It wasn't jealousy exactly, not at first. It was something stranger, like a puzzle piece sliding into place inside my head. A few weeks earlier, $75 had been impossible. Now more than $1,000 had appeared without hesitation. And for the first time, the explanation I had been using my whole childhood, that money was the problem, or timing, or practicality, stopped fitting. The pattern didn't feel accidental anymore. It felt selective. I remember walking back to my room that afternoon and sitting on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. It was the first moment I understood, even if I couldn't fully admit it yet, that something about our family rules didn't apply to everyone the same way. High school made the pattern impossible to ignore. Brielle was everywhere, weekend after weekend. I'd see her off at the airport for dance competitions in cities I'd barely heard of. She'd come back with ribbons, trophies, and stories that seemed to expand in size the way her wardrobe did every few months. Each time, my parents were there in full force, cheering, taking photos, booking flights, making sure every detail of her trip went smoothly. The energy in the house shifted around her like a permanent spotlight. Meanwhile, my passion was quietly growing in a different corner of the world, the school kitchen. I signed up for a small baking society competition, something modest compared to a cross-country dance tour, just to see if I could measure, mix, and bake with precision under pressure. The entry fee was small, barely more than pocket change, but when I mentioned it to my parents, their reaction was dismissive. They told me it wasn't necessary. "It's just school," they said. "Don't worry about it." And just like that, my chance to participate felt invisible next to Brielle's whirlwind of rehearsals, choreography, and elite training sessions. It wasn't that they actively said I couldn't do it, they just didn't support me, and the effect was the same. I'd come home, clutching recipes I wanted to try or photos of cakes I admired online, hoping for a little encouragement, and often the room felt hollow. Brielle's world kept expanding, and mine was politely shrunk to fit in the background. But there was one person who saw me differently. Ms. Alvarez, my culinary instructor, had a way of noticing when someone's focus went deeper than surface interest. I still remember the first time she called me aside after class. She didn't lecture or offer empty praise. She simply said, "You really mean this, don't you? You're not just interested, you're serious." Her words hit me in a way that left me both exhilarated and nervous. I wanted her approval, and I wanted to prove that she hadn't just made an offhand observation. With her encouragement, I began spending extra hours in the kitchen, refining techniques, experimenting with textures, and testing recipes I'd never dared to try at home because I didn't want to risk a mess. The kitchen smelled of sugar, butter, and vanilla. The heat from the ovens pressed warm against my skin, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my energy and attention were not being ignored. Ms. Alvarez didn't compare me to anyone. She treated my focus as worthy. Every fold of batter, every perfectly piped swirl on a cupcake, every tiny experiment that failed or succeeded became its own quiet validation. At home, life carried on with the same rhythm. Brielle's competitions, her trophies, the way my parents celebrated her achievements, it all continued as if my own pursuits were invisible. And yet, with Ms. Alvarez noticing me, I began to realize that passion could exist outside their approval. I could be good at something and have it matter, even if my family didn't see it. That small seed of recognition became a quiet but insistent proof that I wasn't entirely invisible, even if the world I grew up in had tried to convince me otherwise. By the time I was 19, I had accumulated enough confidence and skill that something huge finally happened. I got accepted into a respected professional baking academy. When I opened that acceptance letter, I remember feeling like I was holding a golden ticket in my hands. The paper itself didn't sparkle, of course, but the possibilities it represented were enormous. I could finally see a future that didn't feel small, one where my dedication might actually pay off in a way my family had never acknowledged. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe in hope. The next step, obviously, was getting the tuition together. I had saved some money from part-time jobs and baking gigs, but I needed a small loan from my parents to cover the remainder. I approached them carefully, like I was walking on fragile ice. I explained the situation, the acceptance, the fees, the timeline. I even drew out a plan showing how I'd pay them back. I wanted this to feel responsible, like they couldn't reasonably say no. And yet their response was as familiar as it was deflating. They said they didn't have the money. Not that they couldn't justify it, or that they were stretching their finances for something else. They just didn't have it. I remember the words ringing in my ears, and I wanted to ask if they were serious, if they even realized what this meant to me. But I didn't. I just nodded, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to swallow the first real wave of disillusionment I'd felt in years. I walked away from the conversation with my stomach knotting tighter and tighter. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. I tried to shake off the creeping sense that the world my parents occupied didn't include my ambitions. For a few hours, I stared at the acceptance letter, the paper becoming almost absurdly heavy in my hands. How could something so tangible, so earned, be so effectively dismissed? Even as I rationalized, maybe they really couldn't help, maybe this was just timing, I felt hope collapsing quietly, like a cake that hadn't risen properly. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. There was no yelling, no door slamming, just the slow sinking realization that the financial support I had assumed would come from the people who were supposed to care wasn't coming. And while I tried to tell myself I could figure it out on my own, part of me was already bracing for the kind of disappointment I'd learned to feel over the years. The pattern was familiar. Brielle's dreams funded without hesitation, mine constantly negotiated or dismissed. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but that day, for the first time, the unfairness felt enormous and undeniable. I sat down at my desk, acceptance letter in hand, and felt that quiet, uneasy mix of pride and despair. I had achieved something incredible, and yet the people I thought would be most invested were absent. I didn't cry yet, but I felt the edges of my hope start to fray. A few days after that conversation, the truth hit me in a way that felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I walked past the living room and overheard my parents on the phone, arranging something for Brielle. At first, I thought maybe it was another small competition. But as I listened, the numbers landed like bricks, roughly $14,500 for her to attend an elite dance training program in Manhattan. I had to check my ears, sure I'd misheard. $14,500 for a single program. It wasn't just the amount, it was the timing. Just days after I'd asked for help to attend the baking academy I'd worked toward for years, an amount I had hoped they'd cover, a sum that would have changed everything for me, they had found a way to pour that kind of money into Brielle's opportunities without hesitation. The disparity hit me like cold water. My throat tightened. My hands shook slightly, gripping the edge of the doorframe. The clarity was brutal and immediate. The choices were deliberate. The priorities were undeniable. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it. Part of me still wanted to believe it could be a coincidence, some strange quirk of timing, a misunderstanding. But the way Brielle's name flowed so easily in conversation, the excited anticipation in my parents' voices, the ease with which the funds were arranged, it couldn't be anything but intentional. The sick feeling in my stomach mixed with a new, sharper awareness. Every little dismissal, every polite brush-off I'd received over the years, every "we don't have the money" excuse, it all lined up in a way that I couldn't unsee. The patterns from my childhood, the laptop, the overlooked baking competitions, the constant spotlight on Brielle, weren't random. They were deliberate. I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, not yet. Just a deep, sinking awareness that the life I had imagined my family supporting me through wasn't going to happen. That hope I had clung to, fragile but real, began to collapse under the weight of clarity. It was the kind of realization that makes you feel both very small and very alone in the same breath. I remember walking to my room and closing the door quietly behind me. My reflection in the mirror didn't look the same. I wasn't just the overlooked older sister anymore. I was someone whose dreams were being actively deprioritized in favor of someone else. I had been naive to think fairness was automatic, or that love alone would guarantee support. And yet, in that moment, a tiny ember of determination flickered. If my family wouldn't invest in me, I realized I would have to find another way. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but the first step was recognizing the reality. My path wasn't theirs to fund. My journey would have to be mine entirely. I came home that evening expecting the usual quiet tension, maybe a little awkwardness lingering from the tuition conversation. What I found instead stopped me cold. My room, my entire life up until that point, was gone, or at least packed into garbage bags that lined the hallway. Clothes, textbooks, childhood mementos, even my old baking notebooks. Everything I had built, carefully and quietly, was compressed into plastic sacks, stacked by the front door as if they had suddenly become useless clutter. I froze for a moment, gripping the doorknob. The smell of the bags, cheap plastic, a faint hint of detergent, mixed with the lingering scent of the house, making it feel unreal. I walked inside, touching one bag lightly, hoping maybe it wasn't real, that maybe someone would say I was joking. But the silence of the living room, the emptiness of my shelves, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator made the reality undeniable. My parents were there, standing casually in the kitchen. No raised voices, no dramatic explanations, just an almost polite air, like they were carrying out a routine chore. And in that calm, measured tone they'd always used when dismissing me, they effectively ended the conversation before it could even start. I didn't need words, they'd made their decision. My presence, my needs, my future, they simply weren't part of the plan anymore. I remember sitting on the edge of the hallway, the weight of disbelief pressing against my chest. I couldn't cry at first. My mind was spinning, trying to reconcile everything. I was 19. I had plans. I had just been accepted into a prestigious baking academy. And somehow, none of that mattered to the people who were supposed to be my family. The reality of being homeless in a house I had lived in my whole life was surreal. I felt untethered, like the floor had been pulled out from under me. I walked through the apartment slowly, touching the empty shelves, the bare desk, the spaces where my things had been. Each touch was a jolt, proof that this was real, that they hadn't just ignored my dreams, they had actively erased me from the home I had known. For a brief moment, I felt the kind of anger and hurt I didn't know how to process. But more than that, I felt confusion, shock, and an overwhelming sense of displacement. There was no argument, no shouting match to mark the betrayal. Just the stark, quiet fact that I was no longer welcome. I stepped outside with a couple of bags, my body tense, my stomach churning, not knowing where I would go next. The evening air was cold and sharp against my skin, and the city street felt both vast and lonely. It wasn't just homelessness. It was the sudden, irreversible severing of a relationship I had assumed would last my whole life. I was thrust into a kind of adult solitude before I was ready, and the only thing I could hold on to was the realization that I had to figure out how to survive, and quickly. After the shock of being thrown out, I didn't have anywhere to go. That first night, I slept in the back of a friend's car, gripping my trash bags like they were lifelines. The next day, I called Ms. Alvarez, barely able to form the words, and her voice on the phone was steady, grounding. She didn't hesitate. "You can stay in the spare room until you get on your feet," she said. Just like that, I had a roof over my head again, a temporary safety net, but a lifeline nonetheless. I remember the small room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, but it was mine for the time being, and I clung to that small sense of security. The days that followed were grueling. I found work at Marrow, an upscale restaurant run by Chef Marco Ruiz, starting before sunrise most mornings. My shifts began in near darkness, measuring flour, cleaning counters, washing pans. The work was brutal and exhausting, but I learned to move efficiently, to anticipate the kitchen's rhythms without making mistakes. The first week, my muscles ached constantly, and my feet throbbed from standing on cold tile for hours. Every task felt monumental, yet necessary. But even in the monotony, I watched. The pastry team moved like a single organism, whipping, folding, and garnishing with precision I hadn't seen outside of competitions or Ms. Alvarez's kitchen. I memorized their techniques quietly, noting small flour ratios, the timing of glazes, and how certain textures reacted under different temperatures. I didn't speak much, just absorbed, sometimes scribbling tiny notes in the margins of a notebook I'd tucked into my apron pocket. Every plate I saw leave the kitchen became a lesson. Every whispered tip, a blueprint for the future I was desperate to reach. Over months, small victories accumulated. I moved from scrubbing trays to prepping dough, then to managing basic components for desserts. Each step was incremental, but each felt monumental to me. With every extra hour I stayed after my shifts, I felt a tiny piece of my life returning to me, not through anyone else's support, but through sheer persistence. Eventually, I managed to scrape together enough savings to enroll in the professional baking academy I had dreamed of, the one my parents had refused to fund. Walking into my first class, uniform crisp and notebook in hand, I felt the same thrill I had when opening my acceptance letter, but now tempered with a quiet, determined focus. I understood that this path wouldn't be smooth or supported by family. That meant I had to work twice as hard, pay attention twice as closely, and hold on to every scrap of opportunity I could find. Ms. Alvarez remained my anchor. She would drop by sometimes, asking about my shifts, offering advice, quietly reinforcing that I belonged in this space. Even exhausted and sore, I felt a sense of ownership over my life that I had never experienced before. My parents had discarded me, but here, in the hum of ovens, the swirl of sugar, and the rhythm of whisking, I was constructing a future from scratch, learning that survival didn't just mean keeping a roof over my head. It meant building a life on my own terms. After completing my formal training at the academy, I landed a competitive apprenticeship with Chef Daniela Costa, whose restaurants were revered across the city for their innovation and precision. Walking into her kitchen for the first time was intimidating. The clatter of pans, the intensity in her eyes, the exacting standards of the pastry team, it was nothing like I had experienced before. I started at the bottom, peeling, chopping, and cleaning, but I watched everything with a careful intensity, memorizing techniques, asking quiet questions when appropriate, and noting the rhythms of a world-class kitchen. Over the next several years, I worked long, grueling hours, moving up through the pastry ranks slowly but steadily. I learned to balance creativity with consistency, to innovate under pressure, and to manage teams of cooks while maintaining the integrity of every dish leaving the kitchen. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, when I questioned if I could handle the pace or the expectations. But I remembered what it had felt like to be thrown out, to have my dreams dismissed, and that memory fueled a determination I couldn't ignore. By the time I was 27, I was leading the pastry program at one of Chef Costa's locations. The restaurant earned major recognition under our guidance, and the team respected the balance I demanded between precision and creativity. For me, it was more than professional success. It was a reclamation of the confidence that had been systematically undermined throughout my life. I was finally operating in a space where my talent and commitment mattered, not just to the mentors I had chosen to trust, but to myself. 2 years later, at 29, I opened my own restaurant, Kindle, a dessert-focused fine dining spot I had dreamed about for years. The opening night was a blur of anticipation, anxiety, and exhilaration. Watching the first customers walk through the door, knowing the kitchen I had built from scratch was entirely under my vision, I felt a mix of vindication and vulnerability. In its second year, Kindle unexpectedly earned a major international culinary star, something I hadn't even dared hope for at the beginning. Every plate leaving the kitchen carried the weight of years of struggle, and each accolade confirmed that perseverance, skill, and an unwavering belief in my own work could outweigh the absence of family support. The restaurant became more than a business. It was a declaration of the life I had built on my own terms, a tangible manifestation of the years spent surviving, learning, and proving to myself that I was capable of thriving without the people who had abandoned me. Every compliment from a guest, every mention in a food critics column, every satisfied smile reminded me that the family who had dismissed me wasn't the only measure of worth, and that my vision, painstakingly constructed, could flourish independently. That evening, one of my staff came to me mid-shift with a hesitant expression. "Chef, there's a reservation under your family name," she said quietly, as if speaking louder might summon trouble. My stomach dropped. I excused myself and walked to the dining room, scanning the tables, and then I saw them. My parents were sitting together, smiling and chatting like nothing had ever happened, and Brielle was there too, all bright eyes and easy laughter. It was surreal, seeing them in my restaurant, behaving as if the years of absence, of dismissal, had been erased. They waved when they noticed me approaching, the kind of casual, performative cheerfulness that immediately set my teeth on edge. My parents' pride was on full display, as though simply showing up entitled them to recognition. I felt a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger, but I focused on steadying my breathing. I told my staff to treat them like any other table. No special favors, no comped drinks, no deference. As the evening progressed, the meal finished and the server brought the bill, $842.60. My parents' reaction was instantaneous and loud enough to draw subtle glances from nearby diners. "This can't be right," my father said. "We're family. Surely you'll take care of this for us." Brielle leaned in, smiling nervously. "Come on, we've supported you all these years. We deserve this." The words were meant to be charming, conciliatory, almost coaxing. But they carried the weight of entitlement and denial, the assumption that the past decade of absence didn't matter. I stepped forward calmly, taking the check from the server. I remember the quiet in the dining room, the low hum of conversation pausing as a few nearby tables started noticing. I looked at them and said evenly, "No one gets special treatment here. The restaurant doesn't comp meals simply because someone shares my last name." My voice didn't waver, but I could feel the tightening in my chest, the flash of heat behind my eyes. They argued louder now, leaning into the familiar defensiveness I had known my entire life. "After everything we did raising you, the least you could do is cover this," my mother insisted, her tone both indignant and pleading. I shook my head slightly, keeping my composure. "You chose to end our relationship when I was 19. You've not been part of my life since then. Here, at Kindle, you are simply customers enjoying a meal like any other." The tension was palpable. My parents' smiles had slipped into frozen shock, then irritation, then something that bordered on guilt, but none of it changed the fact that I wasn't moving. Around us, the dining room had grown quieter, the air thick enough that I could feel eyes on the confrontation, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I handed the server the card, signaling the bill needed to be settled. Slowly, stiffly, my parents complied, paying the $842.60 without another word. I stepped back, exhaling slightly, aware of the undercurrent of public scrutiny. It was surreal, vindicating, yet messy. No words of apology, no recognition of their absence, just the quiet assertion of boundaries and the undeniable fact that here, I was in control. Once the payment was made, my parents gathered their coats and left without a word, leaving behind an almost tangible silence at the table where their entitlement had met its match. I felt a mix of relief and residual tension, the dining room slowly returning to its usual hum, but I knew the fallout wasn't over. Within hours, Brielle had posted a dramatic, distorted version of the evening online, painting me as cold and ungrateful. My phone buzzed incessantly, with notifications from strangers reacting to her story. But the tide turned almost immediately. Several food critics and local dining writers who had been present that night shared their first-hand accounts. They described the events accurately: the calm, professional way I handled the situation, the unapologetic refusal to comp the meal, and the clear inequity of my parents' claim. Social media and local news outlets amplified their voices, and instead of harming Kindle, the attention drew in more reservations than we could manage. It was astonishing. People were coming not just for the desserts, but for the story, for the authenticity and integrity of a chef standing by her principles. Predictably, my parents tried one last gambit, filing a lawsuit demanding $32,000, claiming they had supported me all these years and were owed compensation. The legal claim was almost laughable, and my attorney dismissed it immediately. The case never went anywhere, and within weeks, it was officially closed. In the months that followed, I focused on building something beyond the restaurant's kitchen. A few years after opening Kindle, I established a small scholarship for students from unstable backgrounds who wanted to study pastry arts. I wanted to create opportunities for people who, like me, might have been overlooked or undervalued at critical moments in their lives. It felt profoundly satisfying to transform my past struggles into tangible support for others. Through all of it, the final realization settled deep in my chest. The people who had truly stood by me were never my biological family. It was Ms. Alvarez, the mentors who trained me, the colleagues who trusted me with responsibility, and the partner who built a life alongside me. They were the ones who had invested in me when my parents had chosen absence, neglect, and conditional approval. They were my real family, and I could finally accept that the door would always be open for them, and closed for those who only arrived when life had become convenient. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check the description for another incredible tale you won't want to miss.